Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of LitFestX. We are joined by Ms. Marion Molteno from the United Kingdom. Marion actually was born in South Africa, and she's a South African novelist. She won the 1993 David Thomas Prize, for her book A Shield of Coolest Air. In 99, she won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, Best Book, Africa. Marion has also, done a, certain amount of, if I can say, Marion, correct me if I'm wrong, activism sort of work whilst in her time at Africa. And, and then she left and, came to United Kingdom and has been writing several books ever since. Her latest book, or one of her recent books, is on Ghalib. And very intriguingly, that we have, a non-native Urdu speaker, writing a book about Ghalib. So, without further ado, Marion, first of all, welcome to LitFestX, and
thank you very much.
Tell us about the famous Ghalib, and how come you're writing a book about one of possibly the world's most sought after and favorite and most loved Urdu poets.
Okay, well, first of all, I should make clear that I edited this book. I didn't actually write it. But the author himself was also not a mother tongue Urdu speaker. It's Ralph Russell, he was described as the greatest Western scholar of Urdu. That means for anybody not as a mother tongue speaker. He spent a lifetime studying Urdu literature, and particularly Ghalib. It was his life's work. And very later on in his life, when he'd actually retired, I met him because I wanted to learn an Indian language. I was teaching English to speakers of other language, to people who'd come to live in Britain. I was living in Britain at the time, as I still do. And I was teaching English, and I thought, while I'm teaching my language, it's a good idea I should be learning one of the languages of the people I'm teaching. And so I started with Hindi. And then after a while, I met Ralph Russell, and I realized he was an amazing teacher. And with this guy, maybe I could learn to speak conversational Urdu reasonably, which I did. But then I discovered in listening to him that he had a huge knowledge. It wasn't just as a language teacher, he had a huge knowledge of the literature. So I began reading little things that he gave me to read. And then I kept saying, this is fantastic. Other people would find it interesting, should be in a book. He'd actually written lots of books much earlier in his career, but then he devoted himself to studying Ghalib and hadn't published for a long time. So I became his editor, and he used to describe me as an ideal audience because I knew so little. So if he felt that he could communicate about Ghalib to me, he felt that anybody who knew nothing about Urdu and about its literature would be able to understand. So that's how I came to be his editor. And he died some years ago, about 7 years ago. And I'm his literary executor now, so I'm responsible for keeping his wonderful work in print. And it's in that capacity that I've edited what he wrote about Ghalib into a new book.
So tell us about the interest in Ghalib, both for Ralph Russell and for yourself.
Well, I had never heard the name Ghalib until I started studying with Ralph. I think he hadn't when he came to India. He came to India as a young man during the Second World War. He was conscripted in the army and attached to the Indian army. And the British officers were given some basic Urdu to learn. Most of them didn't take it seriously at all. He was politically quite aware. He was very much in favor of Indian independence, and he wanted to talk properly with his soldiers. So he learned Urdu very well. But at the end of the war, he came back to Britain. And he then wanted to keep up his link with that world. So he studied Urdu literature at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. And then he went back to India after he had his degree, and he spent a year there studying with people in India. So he knew about Ghalib from studying at the university. I'd say Ghalib is extremely well known anywhere where Urdu speakers have settled, among them. But there is this particular problem, is that many children of those Urdu-speaking communities worldwide do not read Urdu with any ease. And I think that's true even in India. That I think there are people from Urdu-speaking families who've had their education through English medium and who don't very easily or very often read Urdu poetry. So people from Urdu-speaking communities will know Ghalib from hearing it sung, from hearing people quote it, his poetry. And in the rest of the world, among Urdu-speaking communities, yes, he will be very well known, but among the rest, not at all. And Ralph used to say that Ghalib was such a great poet. If his language had been a world language, such as English, he would be known worldwide as one of the greatest poets ever. But because his language was not spoken much outside his own country, the number of people outside of that world who know him is small. And he had this great ambition to introduce Ghalib to English speakers. But of course, to do that, it has to be done through translation. And everybody knows poetry is very difficult to translate. And Ghalib, because he wrote in the form called the Ghazal, which is not known outside Urdu, Persian-speaking communities so much, he had to find a way to translate that. So my knowledge really comes via the translations.
And when you started this process of editing the book, did you then have to also delve into Ghalib's sort of original works as well?
Well, when I was studying with Ralph, I became very interested in Ghalib, partly because I saw how he was part of Ralph's everyday life. He would quote things from Ghalib at any occasion. Whatever was happening, he had a verse that he would quote about it, and I got very intrigued. So then I asked if I could study Ghalib with him, which I did. So I studied Ghalib in Urdu, but with the help of his translations. And he worked on his translations for about 30 years with an Indian scholar called Khurshidul Islam. They worked very closely together, but they never got to the point of publishing them. And then Ralph felt inhibited by publishing on his own if Khurshid wasn't ready to publish. So it was really only late in his life that he began to publish stuff about it. And before he died, he had plans which he wished to carry out, but he didn't have the energy and the time then. So we discussed them in detail, and he suggested to me how I should go about editing lots of different things that he'd written about Ghalib and bringing it into one book, which is what I did after he died.
With poetry, certainly, and all the more if it's in a language which you don't speak, some of the nuances obviously get lost in translation. And so did you see Ralph actually working on that part of translation whilst you were studying with him?
Yes, very much so. He described his collaboration with Khurshidul Islam as about as perfect a translation collaboration as you could get, because they each knew both languages well, and each of them had one of the languages as their mother tongue. So Khurshid, because he was a scholar who'd grown up with Urdu, he basically did a first selection out of the whole corpus of Ghalib's Ghazals, his poetry. He selected the verses and the bits that he thought were most worthwhile translating. And then he and Ralph would sit together year after year, hour after hour, and they would discuss each verse in great detail, and Khurshid would make sure that Ralph completely understood all the nuances that an Urdu speaker would hear in that verse. And then Ralph would do his best to make an English translation of that, and he would bring it back to Khurshid, and they would discuss it, whether it had captured the verse, etc. I think it's not possible for there to have been a better method of translation.
And this whole process, if you will, the way you describe it, sounds so enticing, of two people with different mother tongues coming together, collaborating, and trying to understand the work of one man,
yes,
and translating it, and especially poetry, and a poet like Ghalib. Have you covered some of that process in this book as well, which you've edited? The interaction between Ralph and Khurshid?
I haven't, but Ralph was a great autobiographical writer. He wrote at great length about his own processes. And there was a journal that came out from a university in the United States called the Annual of Urdu Studies. It was a wonderful journal. Unfortunately, it's run out of money to continue. But the editor of that journal in its last stages, Muhammad Umar Mehman, basically he was happy to publish an article by Ralph in every edition. And Ralph began writing. He wrote a long essay about his own collaboration with Khurshidul Islam. He wrote about the history of his own love for Urdu and how it developed and who it influenced him. He wrote quite humorously about many of the Urdu scholars that he'd met and worked with. He was quite an argumentative fellow. He felt very strongly about things, political things. He was very radical politically, but he also felt strongly about literary things. So he had arguments in the journal as well with other scholars. It was a very lively process. This is not in this book, because this book is not written for scholars. This book is written for people who know nothing about Ghalib, but maybe have heard that he's a good poet, and they think, well, I'd like to find out something about him.
And have you also then translated some of his key poems in this book as well?
Not me. Ralph's translations are there. If I hold it up, I don't know whether it's going to be possible for your viewers to see, but this is the cover of the book. And in the second half of the book, there are selections from the verses. And you may be able to see that they're there in 4 different versions. There is the Urdu original. There is the same verse transcribed into Hindi script, so that if you're a speaker of Hindi, not of Urdu, they're very close languages, you may be able to not read the Urdu, but you might be able to read the transcription in Hindi, and then you can hear exactly what it is. And then it's transcribed in English letters, so that people people who have learned a little conversational Urdu, they understand a few words, but they don't read the script very easily. It's there for them. And then there's the English translation. So this is a pretty unique way of presenting the verses. And there are a selection of 200 verses of Ghalib translated in that way. But then anybody who knows any Urdu can compare it with the original, so that they can see how close the translation is and how it captures the nuances. So the first half of the book is actually about Ghalib, it's text. The second half of the book is the verses.
Right. And, Ghalib, for many people who wouldn't have, read his work even extensively, still is quoted so often, in India and within the subcontinent. There's a certain generation of people who would quote Ghalib, even today in text messages or WhatsApp messages, etc. And I think the knowledge of him is still not very wide. So whilst people know that Ghalib was a great poet and they might be familiar with some of his work, but the extent of his greatness or his background or the way he wrote and why he did so, or about his upbringing, so on and so forth, very little is known amongst the common public, at least of this generation.
I think that's true. And Ralph had a great wish that his book would serve a purpose for people of a younger generation in India and Pakistan, and of the children of the diaspora, wherever they've gone, United States or Britain or whatever. And many, many do. In fact, after he died, I received a delightful message from a Gujarati speaker from Mumbai, who said that he loved Hindi movies. And as many people know, many of the script writers on Hindi movies were actually Urdu poets, who, after it happened immediately after independence, Urdu speakers who didn't go to Pakistan, who were writers, quite a lot of them got jobs in the film industry. So the songs in Hindi movies are very much influenced by Urdu poetry. And this Gujarati speaker said that he loved Hindi movies, and so he wanted to learn more about Ghazals, the poetry which inspired them. And it was only when he found Ralph's books that he actually got an insight into it. He said it was amazing. It was like he combined the knowledge of an expert with the familiarity of a favorite uncle who took you off to the ice cream parlor or to the cricket ground or something, that he managed to explain it in such simple ways. And I think that is actually the importance of Ralph Russell. There are many wonderful Urdu scholars, of course, many who know far more in detail because they've grown up with the language and the literature. But Ralph understood what it was like to come at it from the outside. He had found it very difficult poetry to understand when he first encountered it, and he never forgot that. So he had a way of being able to explain it to people who were new to the poetry. And that's what I've edited. I've gone through all his writing and picked out the bits which do that explaining, and that's what I've edited into the first part of the book.
Right. I'm tempted to shift gears now. Since I'm in conversation with someone who's obviously had an interest and then a lot of knowledge now on Ghalib. So tell us for the uninitiated, let's say, tell us a little bit about Ghalib. About
Okay.
his work, broadly, and who he was, and why he was the poet that he was, this great poet of his era.
Okay. Well, Ghalib was born at the end of the 18th century, and he died in 1869. He lived most of his adult life in Delhi, and this was Delhi under the Mughal emperors, but in the last days of the Mughal Empire. So when Ghalib was just a child, by then already the British had been established in Delhi, and the Mughal emperor was just an emperor in name. But he maintained a very illustrious court, and he was a great patron of the arts, and the art form which everybody in that society valued more than any other was poetry. So to be a poet in those days, Ghalib was born into that aristocratic world, really. He was quite poor. He wasn't a well-off aristocrat, but he was very aware of his nobility and his background. And for those people, poetry was what the education you gave your children, your boys, actually. And he was extremely deeply versed in Persian poetry, which is the background for Urdu poetry, from childhood. So he lived his life until the events of 1857. He lived his life as part of that world. And then when the experience, which in British history at the time was described as the Indian Mutiny, and which in India gets described as a war of independence, when that happened and the British took extreme reprisals against the people of Delhi, he lived through a period of real terror and real hardship. And during that time, he was parted from his friends you could not see any of them. And he wrote letters. So the letters that he wrote at that time, they were the great comfort to him, but they were also the source of a lot of what we know about his life. And at the time, he was already very well known. People told many anecdotes about him. So there's a whole aura around his life as well. And one of the first books that Khurshidul Islam and Ralph Russell wrote together was called Ghalib, Life and Letters, which uses his letters to tell the story of Ghalib's life. So if anybody's interested in knowing a little bit more about it, it's a wonderful book. It's still in print with Oxford University Press, and it's a great read. The thing about his poetry is that he wrote in a form which is very much loved in the Indian subcontinent and in Iran, where it comes from, the Ghazal. But this is a form which is very strange to people outside of that world. So what Ralph felt needed doing was explaining this particular form of poetry to people in other cultures so that they could get an entree into Ghalib's work. So there are a few things about the Ghazal make it difficult for outsiders, which I could talk about, but maybe you want to stop and ask me another question?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that, a lot of, association with Ghazals is not so much about reading, it's more about hearing someone sing Ghazals. And with Ghalib's work, I mean, I haven't read much of it, very little, but with Ghalib's work, people enjoy reading it and quoting it, not just listening to the Ghazal as well.
Yeah. Yes.
And so in your, interactions with Ralph and, when you were doing your other research and editing the book, did you find that, the Ghazal and the, other work that you all were scrutinizing, was it all so much about reading, or was there an element of listening to some of the sung versions as well?
Well, you know, my entree to it was through reading, but that's very unusual. As you say, for most Urdu speakers, their entree is through listening. And of course, I've listened to some, but I didn't get to know it by listening. I got to know it by reading. But one of the first things that Ralph explained to me, and that he explains in his book, is that it is a form of poetry meant to be heard, not necessarily sung, can be recited. Sure. And people in other societies may not know about the institution of the mushaira. So maybe I'll just explain that among Urdu speakers, it's a very common thing to get together and people recite their own poetry. I don't know very many Urdu speakers who don't think that they're poets as well. Everybody likes to compose poetry if they've had a certain level of education in it. So a gathering of poets will be people reciting their own poetry. Now, if the poetry is designed to be heard without it being there on the page for you to look at, obviously you've got to be able to take it in immediately. So there are some features in the poetry which help the reader do that. And one of the main features is that you might have a poem that on the page, it looks like it's got 12 verses, but every single one of those verses is a couplet, 2 lines only, and each one is independent in meaning. So if you're listening, you only have to take in 2 lines. What does that mean? What is the poet saying? And then he goes on within the same meter and the same rhyme scheme. So it sounds like the same poem, but a completely different topic. Now, to English speakers, that's very confusing. They've grown up thinking a poem is a poem. It's all going to be about one thing. And if you simply give them a book of translations of Ghazals, they'll read it and they'll say, well, this poem doesn't make sense. He's jumping all over the place. I don't know what he's saying. And the first thing they have to know is that what he's saying is contained in 2 lines. And then you put on a new gear and you look at the next one. And the next thing you need to know is that not every couplet is going to be wonderful. And nobody expected it to be. So that when people quote Ghalib, they are taking just 2 lines, maybe out of a 10-line poem, and that's the one that everybody remembers. And that's the one that people quote. For me, as somebody who's not a native speaker of Urdu, it's very useful to have the page. Then I can take it slowly and I can ask the meanings of words I don't know.
Right, right. No, I agree. I think the book has been put together very innovatively so that, you know, people with varying degrees of proficiency with Urdu, Hindi, and English language can actually, you know, take benefit of Ghalib's work. At this point in time in the session, Marion, I'm seeing a few questions coming in from our online viewers. Shall we take maybe 1 or 2 questions?
Of course.
So there are actually 2 questions. I'm going to, you know, show it to you on your screen so you can answer it. The first one is from Katha, and here it is. It says, Marion, what makes Ghalib the poet he is known as? But before you answer that, Marion, there's another question, and I think both of these would go well together. And the second question here on your screen now is by Urvashi, and she says, what transcends his work through countries, cultures, generations?
Right. I'm very pleased to have those questions because that is the point of it. We wouldn't struggle to understand a poet in another culture unless there was something really worthwhile there. And that's what Ghalib is known for, is the depth of what he says. He has an amazing ability. I mean, when you think about it, the challenge to say something meaningful in 2 lines, it's very great. And he has, what makes him an expert at that form is his condensed use of language. That every word is really weighty in those 2 lines. Every word carries some connotation, some meaning. That makes it difficult to translate, but even when you have translated it, it's something really to grab onto. And one of the things that I love about Ghalib is that he's a completely independent thinker. He grew up in a very conventional society, but he challenged those conventions. So, for instance, the whole society he grew up in was Muslim. He was surrounded by Hindus, also Christians at that time, and he said, I hold all mankind to be my kin, whether they're Christian, Hindu, Muslim. I don't care what anybody thinks. We're all human beings, and that was a fundamental part of his creed. but he was living in an Islamic milieu, and he was very clever at asking questions within that idiom, but then actually challenging it. So one of the ones that I really like, it's one that Urdu speakers will know as Nata Kuch to Khudata. Ralph has translated it as, I'm just seeing if I've got I think I know it. When nothing was, then God was there. Had nothing been, God would have been. My being has defeated me. Had I not been, what would have been? So we're using incredibly simple words. He actually poses a fundamental philosophical question. We cannot imagine the world without ourselves. If you have a belief in God, how do you go back to a situation when there was not even God? How did the first existence come into? And he summarizes that in 2 lines. It's an amazing feat, really. He also was very explicit in challenging fundamentalism. The idea of paradise, that we do good on this earth so that we'll go to paradise, he thought that was dreadful. He said, God's will be done, but not from greed for heaven's wine and honey. Take hold of paradise, someone, and cast it into hell. The idea is you have a moral sense, and that's what should guide you. You shouldn't be doing good things because you hope to be rewarded. An even more striking one, this is a Persian verse. He actually wrote a lot of his ghazals in Persian, and they too can't be understood by Urdu speakers, mostly without a translation. He said, the mosque is ruined, so I bring its stones into the city and build myself a house there in the unbeliever's lane. So whatever there was in religion that was good, we must keep it and we must build something new with it. But we mustn't continue within the narrow confines of one religion. So that's one aspect of what makes him a great poet. He's also very humorous and has a self-deprecating humor about himself. He's very deep emotions. I think one of my favorites is in Urdu, it's Hazaron Khaish hai aisi ke har khaish pe dam nikle, bahut nikle mere arman lekin phir bhi kam nikle. So in English, how do you translate this? This is such an extreme statement of emotion. And Ralph translated it.
Let me stop you there. Just a
Thank you. Thank you. So for the global audience who don't know, wah wah, when you have a mushaira and somebody's reciting something, if people think that's a good line, they'll say wah wah. So it's a wonderful verse, actually. And in English, this is what Ralph did with it. Desires in thousands, each so strong it takes away my breath anew. And many longings were fulfilled. Many, but even so, too few. Now, if you look at the translation, and those of you listening who know Urdu, there is not one word in that English translation which is not exactly there in the Urdu. It's got the qualities of a literal translation, and yet it's in the poetic meter of the original. It sounds like poetry in English. Another thing I want to say to the non-Urdu speaking audience out there is that because this is a poetry you hear, you can't take in anything so quickly. So they often recite the verse twice. So I'm going to recite that verse one more time for you to listen to it. Desires in thousands, each so strong, it takes away my breath anew. Many longings were fulfilled, many, but even so, too few.
Marion, this has been, just really enchanting, if I can say so. You're sitting in England, and here I am in Mumbai, and we've got viewers possibly from both countries, and a few more, and we are having you recite Ghalib both in Urdu and then in English. It is just fantastic. I wish this could just go on and on. It's lovely to hear it from you. But we are bringing this session to an end now. I'm sure your fans and readers would love to get their hands on your book. and we wish you tremendous success with it, and more power to your pen, and may you keep enchanting readers with all your lovely writing.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight to be here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.